for that. There is one more question coming up. Okay, this second and final question is, do you use a rubric or marking scheme when you assess online discussions? So do you currently in your professional practice use a rubric or some marking scheme when you assess students' online writing? I suppose one or two people have commented that they sort of maybe use something like a fairly formal rubric that you use. So unless you use a formal rubric, a written rubric, I would ask you to vote no to that. Thank you very much. 16 people have voted. 11 people do use a rubric and 5 do not. The comments are interesting too. Gillian has written, not for a year or so, and the one used was simplistic. Gillian, that's one of my findings, that the rubrics, when they are used, can be very simple indeed. Okay, looks like the final result is what just changed. Okay, but okay. Final result seems to be 12 people do use a rubric and 5 people do not. I think it was Jeff's first webinar in May. I'm sure it was Jeff, that someone said that in their research only 50% of teachers used a rubric when they were assessing online work. So we're running at about 33% in this webinar. So not that surprising that we are maybe a wee bit more experienced here than the general teaching community. But it's interesting to note that in another piece of research, 50% of lecturers did not use a formal rubric when assessing online writing. The figure here is about a third of us are saying we don't use rubrics. Okay, thank you very much for that. Right, that was a wee introduction to my talk. My real talk will have 4 sections. It's pretty traditional when you report research findings that you do what I am proposing to do. I'm going to tell you the research question, explain my methodology, outline my findings, and propose some actions that I think we should do. So just before we make a start on that, can I do some background for 5 minutes? Okay, before I tell you what my research question was, I want to talk about the definition of assessment that I used, the characteristics of assessment that I applied to rubrics, and something that many of you will be very familiar with is the new affordances that Web 2 potentially offers faculty. Okay, here's the definition of assessment that I used in my paper. I have to say that I've been looking at definitions of assessment for a long time, 10 years or more, and this one is by a guy called Angelo, let me just tell you the date. 1995, so it goes back 15 years, but in my opinion, it's probably the most comprehensive but succinct definition of assessment that I've come across. So I'm a fan of Angelo's definition. I have noticed it in several papers, you know. So it's maybe a definition that the academic community across the world is beginning to coalesce around. In case you're wondering what the bits in bold, why I've put bits in bold, it's simply because they support, I would argue, that they support the use of a rubric. Angelo talks about making expectations explicit and public, and that we should be using criteria and standards and systematically gathering and analysing evidence. And I would say all of those words would infer that you need a fairly formal marking scheme. Okay, so a definition of assessment that I'm certainly a fan of. The characteristics of assessment will be well known to you. I won't go over validity and reliability. I'm sure most of this audience know what those words mean. But something that was new to me and I found really interesting was something coined by an Australian guy. I'm sure many of you know Royce Sadler from Griffith University in Brisbane. I'm sure many of you know Royce's work on fidelity. But I found it particularly interesting. And, well, the definition of fidelity is coming up, so I'll say no more. But fidelity plays a large part in my paper.